Welcome to the Filmed Live Musicals podcast, a podcast about stage musicals that have been legally filmed and publicly distributed. The Filmed Live Musicals website contains information on nearly 200 musicals that have been captured live. Check it out at filmedlivemusicals.com. And now, on with the show. Welcome to episode 29 of the Filmed Live Musicals podcast. I'm your host, Luisa Lyons, and joining me today is multi-award-winning director and multimedia designer Jared Mezzocchi. In 2020, he was named by the New York Times as one of 5 artists to watch post-pandemic. He has worked with theaters across the United States and internationally, and is currently a resident artist of the Woolly Mammoth Theater Company in Washington, D.C. Jared is also an associate professor at the University of Maryland, where he built a unique production design course. If you're not following Jared on Twitter, you are missing out on an extraordinary discourse about the present and future of digital theater. Welcome, Jared.
Thank you for having me.
So to start off with, what made you fall in love with theater?
I've always loved theater. I, as a young child, I did a children's theater, Andy Summer Playhouse, which now I'm the artistic director of. And it was kind of to get me involved with something. And I remember they got cast as like grown-up number 48 and Prince number 3 in The Little Prince. And it was about the community. It was about the ensemble. And what struck me was on closing night, realizing it was the last time we would do it, but also that we had done it so many times. That became like totally overwhelming to me as a young child. And that was the bug. I mean, it was just like, wow, we get to make things in real time that ultimately have a shelf life. And so we do it again and again and again and again to see how close we can get to, feeling that ultimate fulfillment of like totally getting the thing as rehearsed, into space. And yet it's the journey to get there that makes it more important than the product. So I don't know, it was very early on. And then my whole life has always been intertwined with theater and film. I worked my first job was at a drive-in movie theater for 5 years. And I remember I would always take out the trash at the moment of like a fearful moment in like a horror movie, just to see all the cars shake and being like, wow, it's a film, but I'm seeing all these cars shaking. Like, I don't know. I look back on that now and realize how influential that was to multimedia as opposed to film or theater. And so, yeah, I've just always loved the idea that you can tell stories and affect people in very deep ways, and that people are willing to go into a dark room or wherever they are to like just silently observe a what if in the world. And I think that became very clear early on in my life, and I've loved it ever since.
I really love that idea of a drive-in cinema as theater, that it's an event. It's the act of like driving up, and like there's a real liveness to it, even though you're watching something that's pre-recorded.
Yeah, and there's like a slightly different community than a movie theater because you're under the night sky. Everyone can hear each other because you're in your car. There's an anonymity to it, and yet you're able to talk to each other or crack a joke, or like it's a softer restriction than a movie theater. And there's something about that melds the theater and the film to me, and as a worker there observing it, I felt like even the cars were a part of the performance, so watching that was kind of remarkable.
That's so cool. And kind of a nice like tie-in with the pandemic that some shows pivoted and did live shows which were filmed at drive-ins.
Yeah.
So
Totally.
I like that connection. As you were growing up, were you watching recorded theater on screen, or was it like very defined live theater, film separate?
It was super defined live film and theater. I at my high school, I was a member of a group called SABA, which was Students Against Boring Assemblies. And it was me and a couple others. And every Friday, the students led an assembly for like 15 to 20 minutes to start the day off. And we would do like SNL style skits. But because I was so interested in filmmaking as well at that time, we would film things and perform things and kind of like jump in and out of both, back and forth. And I think maybe definitely that has influenced me. But going to college, I had to double major in film and theater. I was always told you have to pick one of them. I had always been told you got to choose one way or the other because you can't climb both ladders because it's going to be a full life commitment, and jokes on them.
Yes. A few years ago, I investigated doing a PhD around film live musicals, and most colleges were like, well, you're not really theater, so you can't do theater, and you're not really film, so you can't do film. And there was like one school that was like, oh, yay, we'd love you to do a collaboration between theater and film. It's like, oh, come on, people, this is the future.
Yeah, totally. Well, and it's funny. Every time I was doing film, I was so dissatisfied with the lack of live engagement with there's a time code between the finishing of the art object and the viewing of that art object. And because of that gap, it's a different type of process to manipulate comedy and manipulate drama and horror. And because you're kind of presupposing how the audience will respond to it. And then with theater, I loved it. But after getting my, hands wet in film, I was like, I do miss some of the angles and vantage points of film and perspective. And so I think, and you see on Twitter with me right now, I'm trying really hard to be like, there are positives and positives. And if we can combine the positives instead of see what's subtractive about each form, what doesn't work in each form, I don't know, let's look at what does work in each form. And like, that's where we blend. And I think that that's always been an important part of my life, merging film and theater. It's like, they're both great. They both have fallbacks, but if we can take what's great about both of them and combine them, maybe there's something else,
And that perfectly segues into my next question. I was curious, I listened to your TEDx talk from 2014, was that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I loved how you talked about your mom being a mathematician and your dad being a storyteller and how that influenced you. Could you talk about that a little bit more, the combination of those two elements?
Totally. Yeah. My mom was my math teacher in 8th grade algebra, and she was such a good math teacher. And she would take, she would basically be like, all right, you've got like cops and robbers, and when the robbers are scheming to loot the bank, they're all together. Is there any negative energy inside that room? And we're like, well, they're robbers. And she's like, well, take away your moral compass of it. Like, robbers in a room talking, is that positive to the people in the room? We're like, well, I guess, yeah, that's positive. And she's like, all right, now you've got your cops sitting at the police station, and they're chilling. Is there positive there? And we're like, yeah, that's positive. And then they were like, okay, now when the looting happens and the cops and robbers are now in the same room together, is that a positive experience or a negative? And we're like, well, that's definitely a negative. And she's like, all right, that's multiplying and dividing positives and negative numbers then. And I was like, oh my God, when there's two negatives together, it's a positive. When there's two positives together, it's a positive. And when there's negative and positive together, it's a negative. And that's how she would teach. And so she actually would teach numbers through storytelling so that it was totally ingrained. And storytelling is the way to memorize anything, because empathy, I think, is your best glue. And so that was one thing. And then my dad was always an educator, and he was a behavioral management consultant for students with special needs. And he would always lead conferences by telling anecdotal evidence more so than from the book, and really trying to, and really trying to empathy again, try to have school administrators really empathize with the fact that not everyone can learn sitting at a table and being told to be totally quiet and sit and write for 2 hours. And so how do we reinvent education so that we can include everybody in that? And so both of those were coming at me my whole life. And I think I always loved math. And it wasn't until grad school at Brooklyn College that when I got into programming and learned softwares like Max MSP and Isadora and processor, and that I was like, oh my God, numbers equal image and coordinates and all of these things. And I remember my fellow students being like, how are you like catching on so quickly? And I was like, I just love numbers. And I've always thought that numbers lead to more numbers, not to image. And so, and I love Final Cut. I love all the editing stuff, Final Cut, Adobe Premiere, but it's visual leads to visual. And I think with coding, I just love that numbers lead to image. And because numbers are so flexible and fluid. And, for those listening, that might not make total sense, but that was introduced to me at an early age from my mom and my dad. So.
And could you describe how that has impacted your work?
Yeah, I think as a teacher, I encourage students to think about form and function before content. So many times design meeting 1 and design meeting 2 for designers are like, all right, show us what it will look like. And yet with acting and directing, you have directors talking to actors, not saying, let's solidify what it is. Let's actually understand the infrastructure around it. What are your tactics? What are your objectives? What are your super objective? What is your super objective? So that while you're traversing the trenches in the middle of the show, you're flexible, you're agile, you're listening, you're actually responding to things, and it feels live. And there's a sense of liveness because you're taking things in, because you've built an infrastructure, as opposed to like, now cry here, now laugh here. And I think with designers, I'm like, look, that's form and function. What is the sandbox you're playing in? And what are the tools in which produce things inside of that? And how can that lead you to content? Because when a director sees a cue that doesn't work, you don't want them to say, let's cut it. You want them to say, it's not working yet. And how do we hone in on the deeper question that we are asking inside this particular scene or inside this particular beat? And that's a much healthier relationship to the stage, I think, because you're really behaving like actors on stage. And I tell my students that all the time. And that to me is what I learned about numbers leading to image. Like if you're just building image for image, then if the image doesn't work, you have to kind of stay within that image and tweak it a little bit or cut it all together. And I just love kind of that, like the conversation around, look, this scene, the design wants the actors to get more intimate or wants the actors to feel larger than life. Like that's a much juicier statement than we're in Paris and the Eiffel Tower must be behind us. We can still have the Eiffel Tower behind, but with that intention saying we want everyone to feel larger than life. Well, now you're tweaking scale, color, intensity. There's all these things that you can do to that image that can make the actor or the storytellers feel the thing that the design wants to achieve in that scene. That to me is what I've learned by having numbers and story in my life. My whole life is it's agile, and numbers are very agile.
And I love that plays into something, I can't remember if you mentioned in the TED Talk or somewhere else, this idea of the projections and the scenic design as another character in the show rather than wallpaper.
Yeah, I think about that all the time. I tell myself and my students that, like, look, let's make the art outside of ourselves. So we are the facilitator of the art, and we need to communicate to the art if the art isn't fulfilling its duties in that scene. And that's no different than a director to an actor. And so why can't we, when a director comes up to me, if I have my designer hat on, or if I'm a director going to a designer, I will talk about the art on stage and talk to that designer to say, how do we get that cue to develop itself into where we need it to go, which is no different than being like, how do we, the actor isn't quite persuading me, so let me go talk to them, and then you go talk to them and then you tweak it and then you come back and you're like, okay, how's this? And we run it again. I don't know. There's something more lively about that and more collaborative about that than someone coming up to me as a designer and then being like, what are you doing in the scene? It's like, well, I am trying to get the media to achieve the thing we talked about. I agree. It's not achieving it yet. What can we do? I don't know. There's something about that feels way better. And that is, as I say in a lot of things, design as actor, and cue as tactic, and scene as objective, that there's action points to it, that you can hit the target or miss the target, but you can always tweak it, and live within that.
And it always comes back to the storytelling, because it's always about how is this telling our story?
Totally. Yeah. And again, exactly what you just said, for me, as a creator, content is the byproduct of a really fascinating form and function experiment, and as opposed to, let's go back to the Eiffel Tower. It looks beautiful, but it's not fulfilling the story in that moment. That's a hard place to be, because now you're married to its beauty as opposed to its function. Mm-hmm. And I just always want to enter into a collaborative moment feeling secure about function and form, because that's subtext to me. That's the same thing of like, well, let's change our tactic here and see what that develops as content,
Yeah. And if there's only focus on one or the other, well, really, if there's only focus on form, you're pulled out of that story. It becomes about what you're looking at instead of being immersed in the world of the story that you're
totally
watching.
And yeah, I guess I'm not, also for anyone listening, like, I'm not saying don't start with content. I think it's just a reminder of the balance between those three, and that it doesn't always have to be led by content. And our particularly American theater and our design process demands content really quickly when, case in point, you have design presentations before first read. There's so much discovering inside the first read and so much to discover inside the rehearsal process. To give a storyboard at the beginning of that is a really challenging space to be as designer, because then it feels as though you are unthreading things throughout the rehearsal process or restricting the storytellers because it's already been developed. So how can we strengthen our questioning of the sandbox, in the same way that we tape out the stage space and let the actors roam during rehearsal, or the same reason why there are certain rehearsal props that are needed so that the actor can figure out how to tell the story while holding a coffee mug. That's not the actual coffee mug yet, but it'll allow us to define what that coffee mug will ultimately need to be once we get into later rehearsals. And I think all design has the opportunity to exist inside of that.
Absolutely. And this kind of leads to not being in a physical space anymore. And like the pandemic has just exploded this idea of digital theater. And I know here's a giant can of worms, and what is digital theater?
What is digital theater? Is it theater? Which is kind of the binary I'm fighting online right now. I think, for me, I started the pandemic out saying it's site-specific performance, and the site that we are being specific about is the online portal. That helped me physicalize the digital realm in a way that I hadn't prior to. What if it is a space? Where are the outlets? What if my space and your space, even though we're across the country or across the globe for some collaborations, what if both my office and your office is a part of our site-specific performance? In the same way that when you go to an empty warehouse and there's no light grid, there's only a certain amount of circuitry, there's sunlight pouring through, you don't say like, oh, this isn't theater. You say, well, what do we do? Do we embrace the sunlight? Do we black out the windows? Do we let's check how much power can be pulled from that one outlet? There's no light grids. Let's bring in scoops and flashlights. You're like proactive about it when you're in a site-specific performance endeavor. And so I wanted to start there so that we could be proactive about defining what is space if it is between satellites. And how do we create relationship here? And I say it that way because I don't want to replicate the relationship building that happens on stage, because we're only going to be disappointed. There is a slight latency. There is pixelation. There are all these different things, but we can build that, in the same way that a puppeteer might be like, damn it, we only have socks. It's like, well, you can build a whole show, but you won't build a good show if you're thinking these socks don't look like humans. These socks don't look like, you kind of build out from what you have. And so that's where I started. And that's where I was really attracted to out in the world with others building stuff. And Josh Gelb with Theater in Quarantine is a perfect example. It's like, God, I'm only in this small space. Let me actually make it smaller in a closet and see what I can do from there. And lo and behold, that was his iteration process throughout the whole pandemic. So I think that helped me in my argument against those who say digital theater isn't theater, because it's us defining new space to tell stories in. It is digital. It doesn't need to be flat. The flat portion of digital performance is the portal between two three-dimensional spaces. So how do we use this portal to enable and enhance both spaces of audience and performance? And if we can look at it that way, then there is no space for binary, is it, isn't it, kind of thing. And it becomes an opportunity to create new types of storytelling where the screen is the portal, not the end result. And that's just where I've been. Now, I have seen pre-record versus live. I've seen, live that then gets pushed on demand. And I think those are all things that we have to reckon with, of what are we comfortable with calling theater versus TV versus film? Is the siloing necessary at this point? And at some point, is this a different form altogether that, maybe by calling it theater, we're starting from a place of negation and subtraction, because it isn't in-person theater, it's something else. So is that healthy for us to have to rebuild from there, or should we just call it something else? I love theater, so that's why I want to double down on calling it theater, because I don't think I've changed my form in telling stories over the last 18 months. I'm just telling it through the tools that I used to use as extenders on the stage anyway, as a multimedia creator. So, and I'm intentionally being very broad about it because I don't want to gatekeep. I'm very frustrated with the gatekeepers right now saying it isn't theater, because I also have seen a lot more people who have not been able to get to theater experience theater. And so I just don't want to be that when trying to define this space. What if this is an ever-growing, ever-expansive form and function? Again, like, where does that lead us content-wise? Maybe it leads us to just being this ever-seeping larger thing that can hold all of the things together. And I don't know, that to me is really exciting. The siloing thing is very frustrating in theater, but it also is frustrating in almost every form of art making and academics. And we're having this conversation at University of Maryland right now. What are our areas? What are our disciplines? We both need to define those disciplines so people know where to go when they have a question about a specific discipline. But how are we using that to facilitate an ever expansive hybrid space? And where can that lead us? And, the need to define helps funding, helps all of these different things. But we so easily erase large portions of our community by doing that. And so to me, that's the opportunities in which the question, what is digital theater, offers. And we're just at the beginning of it. So, but the site specific thing is very helpful to me, because it helps us define your space and my space and define the two screens in between. And isn't that what happened when we moved inside with theater and said, oh, we have a proscenium arch and the audience is on this side and the performance is on that side. Sometimes we can run into the audience. Sometimes we can all be on stage. Sometimes we can pull down a movie screen and show an opening sequence of something. By defining the portal, it inspires what each end of that portal looks like. So that's there. To me, there's no difference. So it's hard to hear that feels foreign. That feels like a foreign language to some. And so I really want to spend my energy helping teach the language, as opposed to being like, you don't get it,
Yeah. Oh, there's so much to unpack here. Okay. You talked about gatekeepers. Who do you see as the gatekeepers right now?
Well, I think it's very invisible, and I think it is those who will not allow the net to widen to allow digital theater to be part of the conversation, that are saying, no, the only type of theater is in person, in a venue, and I've seen them combining those two things, or totally exclusive to those two things, but in person, in venue, or in person, venue centric theater making is what makes theater is the underlying theme to a lot of things. And the reasonings behind that are heart rates don't match if you're not together in the same space. The collective breath can't happen. And it's the can't. That's the gatekeeper. And that's been from art makers to audience members to critics to producers. That's been all over the place. So I don't really want to define it as specific vantage points. I see it everywhere. And I really want to dismantle the cannot, and say what if, or what would be needed if, because I have spent the pandemic, I did someone else's house with Geffen. I performed it over 11 weeks, sometimes 7-8 times a week live. I cried almost every night watching people enter the space. We were all on Zoom. I was able to engage with them. We would have collective laughter. We would have collective screams. And so I disagree that it can't. I think there have been a lot of ineffective uses of it, but pre-pandemic, that was the case, in-person, venue-centric as well. And so I think that we have, that's the gatekeeper to me, is those who won't allow the net to widen. And they're just saying, nope, the line is drawn here. And they, in doing that, also forget that the things they're saying are achieved always are only achieved a portion of the time when defined in their terms. So
it's really fascinating to me how humanity is so afraid of technology moving us forward. Like, the same arguments could be made when we started putting things on camera, and when sound became a thing, and then when records became a thing, and cast recordings, and like at every stage of the technology developments, there has been this shift from, oh, that's going to kill insert genre, insert theater, when it's only opened it up to more and more people. Like, look at how cast recordings have made the mega musical possible. And now with the internet and digital, that audiences are suddenly not confined to a single physical theater. They're now possible worldwide.
Yeah, this is my undercooked theory about that. And this is what I'm like stirring the pot on Twitter about. But I think there are two things at play there. One is a concerning insecurity about our form, that something as simple as a digital recording of the cast singing the song will completely dismantle the sacredness of theater is... I have no longer looked at that as like anger and going on the offense. Why are we insecure that in-person theater is like, it's the most beautiful thing to be in a room together, feeling something? And why can't these extenders point back to that and get us excited by that, instead of it feeling like it's going the other way, like it's furthering us from that? So I just want to like demand from our fellow theater makers, like, why are we insecure about that? Let other things happen. It's still going to be amazing when we're all in the room together. And as you just gave a litany of examples on, it's been proven that we will still come back. Like, I'll get the album from a band in go crazy when they come to town and get that ticket. Like, so why are we so insecure about that? That's one question. The other is, I do understand the fear because the dining room table is now saturated with everyone on their phones looking down and no longer having a fruitful conversation as family. Like our nuclear family has been dismantled. The idea of a nuclear family has been dismantled by technology infiltrating our lives. So it makes sense that which we hold a mirror up to society is also afraid of letting too much tech in. But I want to turn that narrative to say, isn't that precisely where theater artists are most important? To say, let's be more conscious users. It's what I said in my TED Talk. Let us be more conscious users of the things that are saturate in our society and our cultural dissonance right now as human to human interaction is moving online. We should be the ones to hold those things up and say, look what it is doing to us, and wield it in a different way so that we are no longer as a culture afraid of it. And so instead of us following suit with culture, we need to lead culture into a different way of using it. And that's where the pandemic got me really afraid, or not afraid, but just concerned, because my fellow peers all followed suit with the fear of technology. And this was the moment that we really should and can be holding all that technology up and saying, what can we do with it? And let's stay simple. Let's stay really small first, like, so that we can say, oh, this is how we could use a camera on a computer. Oh, we could hold it. We could move it around. Here's how we use a microphone. Here's how and start to create really intimate relationships with technology as a conduit of person to person, as opposed to a deterrence. And that, I think, is where I want to be as a theater artist, as a technical storyteller. That's the kind of world that I want to live in. So I think those are the two things that are at play that we have to kind of like lean into and push a little further against. We have to be proud of being in person, and we also have to, for fortunate and unfortunate reasons, wield the sword of technology to say, hey, culture, we're using it wrong, and here's ways that we could use it creatively.
It reminds me of a cartoon I once saw where I think it was like people on a bus or something. Everyone was looking at their phones, and there was one perspective that everyone was isolated and not connecting because they were drawn into their cell phones. And then the other perspective showed the things that people were looking at. And it was like text messages with family and reading articles and like the people sharing things across the screens. So although the physical, like in person, in theory, I put it that in inverted commas, if the interaction is not happening, there is all this amazing connection happening digitally.
Totally. And I think the furthering of that question is, how can we link those two worlds in that comic together, right? At Andy's Playhouse this over the winter, the children's theater I run, we had a dance company, Orange Grove Dance, come in, and we commissioned them to make a work that answered this question: how can your room and my room come together to create a new room? And whatever they wanted to make, if there was text, if it was just movement, and they sent balls of yarn to each of the kids, and they had to think about their Zoom squares and connect yarn from the camera to another part of their room, and then pivot that back to the screen, and that would connect to someone else. So it was like passing a baton. And the Zoom squares looked like a singular room for the first time in the pandemic, because the strings all connected and it was this one image. It was kind of like on Instagram when you put the 9 photos together and it looks like one thing, but it encompassed all of their rooms. And then they figured out how to like move between it. And I remember parents would come in at the end of rehearsal and be like, what have you done to this room? Like, this is so incredible. It's an art piece in and of itself. And so that, to me, answers the question of the dichotomy that is presented in that comic of, you don't see it in one, you can only see it in the other. And what Orange Grove Dance did in that experiment was, you could see it in both, and they both were beautiful and they both were different. And so that gave me a huge answer to be like, that's the thing. How do we activate our spaces to empower them as different and also understand how they are connected through technology?
You mentioned it a little before earlier, the idea of filming a live show and then streaming it either live or on demand later on. How does that play into this world of digital theater?
It's a good question. I should say that my investigations have always been around doing it live. And at any point, if we had to hop to pre-record, I wanted to hop to that as least as possible to be in live. That's not a judgment. It's more of just as an artist, I've been and continue to be keenly interested in the live performance space on stage. I think that the moment you pre-record, again, there's a distancing effect of time. As a viewer, I know it was done prior. So what does that do to myself in terms of my accountability of viewing it? And what can be done in those moments that allow me a different type of liveness? Am I asked to make something or engage with it in a certain way that has to do with the moment I press play? I'm interested in the world where, like, if you were to click play on a pre-record and it cannot pause, like your accountability of pressing play at a certain point is your commitment to the next hour. I'm interested in like removing the pause button from that so that there's a sense of like, I must watch in this moment and be alive in that as well. Though I think that would cause a lot of frustration with a lot of people. Again, it's not like a better or worse. I'm just interested in time and space and how a live event can activate it differently from a pre-record event, but that both time and space is being questioned in all events. How we sit, maybe a pre-record is asking you to sit and watch it in a certain location in your living quarters. I'm about to do a show about a road trip, and I'm wondering, like, do I ask people to go into their car or specifically sit in a seat when they watch it? It will be live. I'll be in a car. So like, how do we, or maybe like get as far away from a car as possible, like be in your bed under your covers, watching it under there. And so it's so dissonant from a car that you can really feel car as you're watching it. I'm just interested in that kind of world of what does it mean for the viewer to activate space, even if the thing being viewed is not happening in real time. And again, those are all questions, so I don't really know where they lead to, but, yeah. And, with pre-record, I did a lot of pre-record. So I also don't want to pretend like I didn't pre-record stuff. I did a lot of projects in pre-record, and I was asking the same questions. So some of the pre-records were, hey, let's not edit it. This is just a live, scene, or in these monologues, let's get it from start to finish, and whatever it is, we can rehearse it a bunch of times, but once we have it, I'm not going to touch it or edit it to make it more exciting. In theater, I think the one thing that I have a hard time with when continuing to call it theater is the editor alone between the thing that was made and the viewing of it. And an editor in real time mixing it is different than an editor on their own editing it later. And that still will be a great product, but I think that's my threshold of what is theater. Is that editor post live thing being recorded. And so I think those are all the questions. I have no answer. So, those are the things though that I'm thinking about, is the time code between the making of and the viewing of, and what are we doing in between those?
So that brings me to asking about the definitions. Like you mentioned, filmed, what were the words you mentioned? Filmed live, pre-recorded, live streamed, all of that kind of thing. So I'm thinking like a very famous example, like Hamilton. It was filmed in front of an audience, but also there were pickups, and an editor later on put it all together, and we watched it 4 years later. So would you call that a filmed live theater, or like what would you call that product?
Yeah, I think as a community, we should come together to define these products. And to me, what's been really great is calling it what it is. as opposed to saying like, it's a, and then you have this kitschy term that you have to also have a definition of. Like, let's call these things what it is. That's why I'm like in-person venue centric, as opposed to in-person live, like in a field. I think that those two things lead us towards understanding of funding, understanding of process. There's all these things that come with saying venue centric. And so with Hamilton, I would say it was a pro filmed, which means like jib arms and steady cams and amazing equipment, but a pro filmed pre-record live event of Hamilton is helpful to say. Now, at a certain point, like how many hyphens can you fit into a word? So I think we have to like come together, because I think as we expand, there'll just be more hyphens, and it'll be like, it'll be a pro record virtual reality meets in person venue centric remote and you're like, okay, Jesus, but I think right now it's important to be naming those things, not to gatekeep and say this is theater and that other thing isn't theater, but just define things for what they are. And maybe let's put the gate away and just, it's all live performance,
And I think to help audiences understand what they're watching, because often, and I've spoken to people within the industry that don't understand the difference between a movie adaptation like In the Heights versus Hamilton. Like, one is a film, a movie adaptation of a stage show, and the other is a live recording of the stage show. And people don't understand the difference between those two, which maybe that's not important. But for me, it is, because there is this whole world of theater on screen that makes theater so much more accessible, and it opens the doors, and it has so much potential. And I don't think audiences yet understand that it's available.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of, Wooster Group, Big Art Group, the Builders Association, Elevator Repair Service, Radio Hall, all these New York-based multimedia groups that, would put their tech tables between the audience and the stage. Like you would often see all of the mixers, all of the light board, all these things right in the front row. And so you as a viewer would have to view over those tables to see the product. And what that did was it educated silently the audience to garner an appreciation of the thing that they were making. And it's, a small sidestep from a director's note, of like, do we really want the artist note being like, I hope you appreciate that it took this much energy to make the thing, but I think there's a performativity to it that gets it, that suddenly is really exciting. And so I think what you're suggesting is really important, which is like educating the audience so that when they walk in, they're not filled with white noise of questioning what it is that they're viewing. They know it so that they can start from the first beat and appreciate the thing and be the viewer that we are asking them to meet us to be. And that, I think, is getting lost in the myriad of different ways in which we're making stuff today, so that all of a sudden people are comparing Hamilton on Disney Plus to an Edinburgh Fringe Fest thing from a hotel room, and that's unfair to both parties, to the audience and to the art maker, because when you go to the park and see a piece of performance inside a toy theater that you walk up to, you have an understanding of its form and function, so that as you're viewing the content, you're deeply appreciative of what they are doing, and there's magic in that. And so that's where I think defining is helpful. It gets dangerous when it starts to become siloing and gatekeeping, but it's really a form of education for the audience to arrive at the appropriate proximity to the piece.
And it speaks to what you were saying earlier about like the importance of liveness, that there's something really powerful that if your show is going to be at 7 p.m. Eastern, that you have to click onto your computer at 7 p.m. Eastern and it's happening at that moment. It also, there's this tension for me about accessibility, that not everyone is available at 7 p.m. Eastern. There are
Totally.
babies and dogs and
Totally.
work, like who knows? And so like how
Yeah.
do we find that balance between liveness and also keeping it open?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't have the answer to that. And I recognize that my want of something happening at 7 is a timestamp to say I was here when, which is also a gatekeeping tactic that I am blind to, which is, but I can't be there then. So then I can't see it. Like, that's a horrible sentence as the alternative. So what is it? I think that's why this new idea in my head of like removing the pause button. So it's like, you can watch it at any point, but watch it in one consumption. Like, that's exciting. But maybe someone can't do that too, because childcare or, for various reasons. So, I don't know. There's something about that. Why is sacred so attached to beginning, middle, and end of something exclusive? Why do we have to have it that way? And I immediately think of TikTok then, because Ratatouille, going there, like, you have all of these people submitting songs that are still happening right now. I'm not talking about the Actors Fund event one that has a paywall on it. I'm talking about the kind of ongoing hashtag of Ratatouille the musical. And I was talking to some colleagues last night, and they were like, God, our consumption is only like a minute now, and then we're done. And I was like, well, but a minute adds up to I think it's at 172 hours if you were to start and finish the whole thing. So there's an embrace of the temporal on TikTok that makes me wonder about that time code, because everyone's watching it in digestible chunks throughout their day, and maybe they binge it, maybe they don't, but the access to it is in beats. What is theater if we can consume it beat by beat, but between beats can be days? That's interesting, and that's TikTok to me. So, so I think that there's something in that, and access is so important. And so how do we allow for all the different ways so that everyone can define sacred the way that they need to define it,
Oh, there are so many possibilities. It's so exciting. I'm just my brain is whirring. You talked about the gatekeepers quite a bit. And aside from the metaphorical gatekeepers and, the very real consequences of them, what do you see as the barriers to digital theater right now?
Yeah, I'm starting to do a deep dive of all the fights inside government conversations about public Wi-Fi. I think Wi-Fi is our largest hurdle. Access to the internet is a commodity, and it is monetized, and it is expensive. And so what can we do there? Now, with the Children's Theater, we got a grant to send boosters and Wi-Fi accessibility to the kids who couldn't get it. And they held it for much longer than the rehearsal process into the rest of the school year. And that increased their experience in education as well. And it wasn't that expensive. And that really cracked a code for me to be like, again, silos are so dangerous, because it keeps the art grants from the education grants, from the business grants, and if we all consolidated that together, I think we would be able to achieve Wi-Fi quite a bit. But also, why does it need to be cost prohibitive? Why are we doing that? And that's big business issues. So I think that's step one, is a huge hurdle. And are there communities? There are community centers and libraries and stuff like that where people can go, but that's not private. And there's a shaming quality to that, in an invisible force of having to go down the road to view something when others on that Zoom account are sitting at their dining room table. So I think that's probably the biggest hurdle. And then the gear, where's the gear coming from for the artist? Where's the gear coming from for the participants in the art making of it? Where's the gear coming from for the viewer if it's a specific device that is needed? Because as we know, if you're building something for the computer screen versus the phone, those are two different builds. That's no different than the challenges we face in venue-centric theater making right now who want to stream. Those are two different production teams, and we're not embracing that. We're not acknowledging that because our scarcity model tells us that there's one production manager for both and there's one AV coordinator for both. So,
and we haven't even begun to discuss like equity rules and all of that whole can of worms.
Yeah. And I think, and I think we need to really think about and define recorded image and who owns that and who is rewarded for that, and who's getting the money at the end when the face of the actor is not, and the producers behind are at great amounts. And that's why also on Twitter I'm circling around contracts. Like, contracts are really complicated, and they are based in the pre-pandemic world, which was a world that did not embrace digital technology even on stage. So, and we've had to, beat around bushes to get media on stage in the ways that we want it to as well. So I think there's a radical reinvention of contract, and that's not going to happen anytime soon. But I will say, if one of those actors, I say it again and again on Twitter, if one of those actors on Hamilton wins an Emmy for ostensibly an archive footage from 4 years ago of a show that they're not even in anymore, I can't wait for every actor to demand their archives. I just can't wait. It's gonna be a great moment.
Bring it on. Yeah. I mean, the self in me that has to update the database and has like a backlog of like 400 shows to get into the database, I'm like not for it, but my nerd self is like, bring it.
And again, it's like, I don't want it to sound like I want to just take it all down. I want to expand. I just want to expand, because as I saw in the pandemic, our audiences expanded, our artists expanded, things happened. And those who are using rhetoric to say, well, digital also has inaccessible issues too. It's like, yeah, no crap. Like, it all has issues. But if we combine the good of digital and combine the good of in person, can we have a wider net? And it's irrefutably yes. We have larger audiences. We have more access points. We have more access points to achieve beyond that. So I just want to get to that place. And, when we celebrate a digital performance and people come back being like, I'm sorry, I can't because it's not people in the same room. It's like, well, you have had the privilege of being in the same room with people. There are a lot of people out there who are not privileged that way. Give them the right to enjoy it. And don't let that feel as though it's taking down your turf. Again, this insecurity that's going to become the norm and pull everyone who can be in person away from in person. That's just not true. It's a false rhetoric out there. So.
Oh, absolutely. It's like the right to theater, the right to internet should be added to the Declaration of Human Rights.
Yeah. Yes, totally.
I wish we had more time. I could keep asking you questions all day long, but I see we're running short on time. But I have a few questions that I ask all my guests. You don't need to think about it too much. Whatever comes to mind is great. To start off with, what is your favorite musical?
I loved Hadestown. It was just an incredible piece. Yeah.
You saw it a few days ago, right? I saw it.
No, I didn't. I saw it before the pandemic, but I just loved it. I loved it.
Such a beautiful show. I would love them to film it, please. Do you have a favorite filmed live musical?
Ooh, I don't. It's great to be on here because it's actually making me recognize I really haven't watched that many recorded musicals. So I've always been in person. So check my privilege, and I can't wait to see.
Well, if you need a list, there's a website.
I know. I'm excited to view it. I mean, I saw Hamilton the musical and saw such great possibilities with what's achievable in that. So I'm excited to see that. I actually have never seen Hamilton in person, so that was exciting to me.
I know many people that are in the same boat.
Yeah.
Very much so. And I would love to another day get into like the possibilities of what digital can do with film live theater. Anywho, we talked about this a lot, but I'm gonna make you do it quickly. If filmed theater is not exactly film and it's not exactly theater, what should we call it?
What should we call it? I mean, I think we should call it. I mean, you're doing it well with filmed live musicals, film live theater. But I don't want it to sound dead. I don't know. Hearing it that way, filmed live theater feels dead. It doesn't feel theatery and live. So I don't know. You know, a filmed happening of theater or something, like to like really emphasize that it's a caught moment of brilliance feels more important than like we filmed the thing.
Caught moment of brilliance. That is beautiful. I love that.
I'll take it.
Where do you stand on bootlegs?
Man, there's a great TED Talk called What is Original? Or I think Is Anything Original? I can't remember. It's in the TED Talk hour. And it talks about the difference between bootlegging versus remixing, and how do we participate in remixing. The only way to do that is to get footage of things and to see things and then become a part of that narrative. So I actually really like the idea of total access to stuff. What I don't like about bootlegging is it's not allowing the artist to be rewarded financially and artistically for it. So I think I'm against bootlegging, but I am for the intent behind it, which when it's not a financial intent, to like get work out there in the world and let people see things that cannot see. The fact that there are bootlegs mean that people feel as though they can't get in. So what do we do about that?
Mm-hmm. Oh, great answer. What do you wish had been filmed? Or what theater do you wish had been filmed?
What do I wish had been filmed? I wish we had recordings of all of the isms that happened at the end of World War II, so that it wasn't just a text account of those moments, because I think we would feel an affinity to that today. And both wars, I think I'm rereading all the manifestos right now, which have their own problems, but I think are really exciting to think about people asking what if. And I just wish that I could see some of the futurists' work and some of the Dadaists' work filmed, so that we could realize we're not that far away from it right now.
Ooh, I love that answer. That's gets my brain going. Finally, what would you like to see filmed in the future?
Everything. Everything.
Really?
And I would love to see as much as possible and iterations, so that we can get into an iterative state as opposed to a perfected state of filming. Give an audience member a GoPro and stream that. Did that work? Give a stagehand a GoPro, film that. Did that work? Give cameras to different vantage points and just see what happens and see where people are like thrilled by. I mean, man, the stage manager calling go in the middle of the pandemic that went viral. That's interesting. Boy, like what are we doing by filming things if not sparking catharsis and empathy towards the space that we cannot get to? So I just want more and more of that, and I want us to go further and further away from prosceniums and film that too. Like, what is space? So everything.
Love that. Yes, please. Thank you so much, Jared. Where can we find you online?
You can go to jaredmezzocchi.com, or my Twitter is where I'm most active right now. I started it only a few months ago, so I'm just like, oh, it's my journal, but you can just go at Jared Mezzocchi on Twitter as well. But jaredmezzocchi.com. I'm about to do a huge flip of my website, and I'm really double downing on digital performance moving forward. I'm still doing in-person stuff, but it all is pointed towards a remote in-person interaction. So check me out on either, and say hi. I love these conversations.
Fantastic. We will have links to all of that in the show notes. And again, thank you so much for your time, Jared.
Yeah, thank you. It's really great to talk with you.
Filmed Live Musicals makes musical theater more accessible, brings joy, and creates a sense of connection for audiences around the world. With thanks to patrons Josh Brandon, Elliot Charles, Rachel Esteban, Mercedes Esteban Lyons, James T. Lane, Al Monaco, David Nguyen, Jesse Rabinowitz and Brenda Goodman, David and Catherine Rabinowitz, and Beck Twist for being a part of spreading the love of musical theater. If you would like to join, you can do so by becoming a Filmed Live Musicals patron. For as little as $3 a month, you'll receive early access to the Filmed Live Musicals podcast, early access to site content, and a weekly newsletter with info on upcoming streams. Visit patreon.com/musicals on screen to learn more. You can also leave a review on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thanks for listening.